Good evening, everyone, and welcome to H Advisor's Book Club. And as is my tradition, I managed to corner one of my favourite writers in the whole galaxy, and we'll come on to astrophysics, at an event a few weeks ago called Matt Ridley, and I said, would you give up some of your time to come and talk about your books to a group of friends and colleagues? And rather wonderfully, he said yes. For those, most of you in the room, I think, should be familiar with Matt and his writings over the years. But he is an extraordinary polymath and a Renaissance man. I mean, a career that spans The Economist, the House of Lords, best-selling books, and even just to give you an idea of the spread of his interests, we were talking about this evening on the phone a couple of weeks ago, and he finished with the payoff line, "I'm sorry, I've got to go. I've got to finish my article for the Daily Mail on extraterrestrial life." Which beats, "I can smell something burning in the kitchen." And I will tell, and I have here a very special book to me that was given to me 15 years ago at a particularly difficult point in my life, and I will tell you more about it soon. And it was an enormous reassurance to me, called The Rational Optimist, and there are copies at the back. It actually is a book for our times. You know, even though it was published 15 years ago, because a lot of us live in sort of quite feel it's all a bit gloomy out there. Heaven knows why. But this actually tells us all to stop worrying. So, Matt, tell me, why should we be optimistic in such dark times?
Well, the dirty little secret is that I'm working on a sequel to that book, and the working title is The Rational Pessimist.
Oh.
I'm not going to call it that. The point is going to be that while I think the world is going to go on getting better for everybody, or nearly everybody, it's not going to go on getting better nearly as fast as it could if we had better policies on lots of issues. So it's the opportunity cost of bad policy that I want to write about next. But I got intrigued by the fact that when I was young, I believed all the pessimism that the grown-ups threw at me in the 1970s, and was genuinely surprised when it all turned out to be wrong. You know, I mean, I thought literally our lifespan would be shortening, famine would be growing, sperm counts would be falling, all these things I was told.
The hole in the ozone layer, don't forget that.
And this was a little later, but the entire world was going to grind to a halt because it couldn't cope with the change of date at one point, the Y2K bug. To have been, I don't remember any grown-up saying anything optimistic about the future when I was young in the 1970s, and yet the world is dramatically better now for almost everybody now than it was then. Just to give you the sort of bold numbers, the lifespan has expanded in my lifetime at the rate of 5 hours a day for most people, for everybody, on average. Child mortality, the worst measure of misery anybody can think of, down by 2/3 globally. And as for extreme poverty, more than half the world lived on less than $2 a day in 2011 numbers when I was born. Now it's about 8%. Nobody's ever lived through a transformation like that. And throughout that time, the dominant view of intellectuals was this can't go on, it's about to get worse. And yet it did keep going on. And we're not just wealthier and healthier, but we're happier, cleverer, cleaner, kinder, freer, more peaceful, and more equal than we've ever been.
I'm going to stop you here, because that's a lot of adjectives there. More peaceful, but surely the world is a dangerous, more murderous place.
And when I went around publicising this book, people would say, have you seen what's happening in Syria? Or have you seen what's happening in Ukraine? Come on, you can't. And I said, have you counted how many wars there are in Africa? It's gone right down. Have you counted how many wars there are in the Western Hemisphere now? 0, halfway through the last decade. So, and Steve Pinker wrote a book about the decline of violence, which was also very helpful. But you're absolutely, what I try never to do is say the world is perfect. I really do not think it's perfect. I think it's a vale of tears compared with what it could be if we got our act together. It's the Panglossians, the people who are the Panglossians are Greenpeace and co, who say, let's not do any more growing, let's not do any more innovation, because it might make things worse. There's a lot wrong with the world, and I've always said, and I said in that book, we could have a nuclear war, we could have a terrible conventional war.
You actually said, the 2020s might dawn and we'll have a terrible flu.
I did say something about a pandemic could yes, be bad news, but I didn't realise we were going to do one on purpose.
But let's nail a few myths. Money doesn't buy you happiness. Discuss.
Yeah, well, there's a thing called the Easterlin paradox. Roger probably knows about this, but sorry, didn't mean to pick on you, Roger. But it was a nostrum in economics that when you got rich, you started getting less happy, and there was some database behind this. And everyone agreed this was a terrible thing, and no wonder the rich are so unhappy. Then someone went and examined the data and found it wasn't true. When you got rich, you got happier. Within countries, between countries, and within lifetimes, there is a correlation between wealth and happiness. Now, it's possible to be very rich and very unhappy, but that cheers up other people when you're like that.
Claire, come forward and say, good, we're doing it without mics tonight.
It probably asymptotes, yes. I think that's probably true, but the percentage of the world that's reached that limit is pretty small, I would argue. They're called Kennedy and things like that,
And that is actually, Claire raises a good point, which is, for all you say about the world being a better place, and people having access to microwave ovens and smartphones, why is everyone so miserable?
Partly because good news is gradual and bad news is sudden. That's not entirely true, but it's mostly true. I can't remember the numbers, 165,000 people, no, that can't be right. Anyway, a very large number of people were lifted out of poverty yesterday, but it's not in today's newspaper, because it's just a continuing gradual trend. Whereas an aeroplane flying into a skyscraper is big news, obviously. Partly because we find bad news more salient. There's been lots of psychology experiments on this, saying, do people actually prefer to consume bad news? And the answer is yes, because then it's more important, it's more interesting. And partly because there's probably an evolutionary psychology thing behind this, which is that, back in the Pleistocene, you and I were walking to the waterhole, and I say, I don't think we should go this way, there might be a lion behind that rock. And you say, no, the world's getting better. And then my genes are in the next generation via your girlfriend.
It got better for the lion. But then also one of the things the book did for me years ago, and it was really valuable, was to shatter the rose-tinted spectacles. Because I think we all have this vision of particularly, merry England and, Victoria,
yes.
Everyone lived, happy lives and, danced around. Tell us about, those happy days of yore that we all know.
I think the best way of talking about that is to talk about the price of artificial light. How long do you have to work today on the average UK or US wage to be able to switch on an ordinary lamp for an hour in the evening and read a book, preferably my book? And the answer is about a fifth of a second. A fifth of a second of work will get you an hour of light. Pretty good deal. If you go back to 1950 with incandescent bulbs instead of LEDs and lower wages and higher cost of electricity and things like that, although Miliband's doing his best to undo that, it's about 8 seconds. 8 seconds of work for an hour of light, still a good deal, but a heck of a lot more time, as it were, 40 times as much. And if you go back to 1880 with a kerosene lamp, you're talking 15 minutes of work for an hour of light. And if you go back to 1800 with a tallow candle, this is based on William Nordhaus's data, by the way, it's 6 hours of work for an hour of light. The ordinary person could not afford a candle. If you watch Pride and Prejudice and they're all dancing, there's hundreds and hundreds of candles in the room. Not many people got invited to that party. most people, the only artificial light they had in their lives was from the fire in the hearth, literally. And of course, imagine the effect that has on literacy as well as everything else. If you can't read a book after dusk, you're never going to become particularly well educated. So it's really important, I think, to strip away the nostalgia about how wonderful life was in the past, as well as to remind people of how it's pretty good today compared with then.
One of the interesting things that I think you do, not just in The Rational Optimist, but in some of your other works, is link innovation with evolution. And you see a direct correlation between Homo sapiens' ability to innovate and the general theory of evolution. Is that a fair? Is that a sort of core thread in your work?
Very much so. I mean, I write quite a lot. I write books about evolution. I write books about innovation, and I think in the end they're kind of the same thing. They're two ends of the same spectrum, because innovation is a lot more evolutionary than we think, and evolution is a lot more directed than we think. So let me explain what I mean by that. If you fly across the Atlantic on an aeroplane, you expect it to be designed by an intelligent designer, right? Nothing evolutionary about it. Well, hang on a minute. He didn't start from scratch. He took a previous design, dropped a few bad features, and added a few good features that he'd heard about. And so on. If you go all the way back to the Wright brothers, that there is a real sense in which aeroplanes have evolved through natural selection. So, for example, in the early 1950s, there were a series of crashes of Comet jets, and it turned out that having a square window on an aeroplane, a pressurized aeroplane going at high speed, leads to metal fatigue. And so now you always have rounded windows on aeroplanes. Just little things like that get accumulated. So, so I wrote a book called The Evolution of Everything, in which I argued that languages evolve, technology evolves, etc., etc. There's a wonderful quote from Adam Ferguson, an 18th century Scottish philosopher, contemporary of Adam Smith, who said, "There are things in the world which are the result of human action, but not the result of any human design." And so something like the English language is constantly evolving, but it's not a natural phenomenon like an earthquake or a population of birds. It's a man-made thing, but it evolves. So I think we underestimate the degree to which technology literally evolves. But I think we also, and this is the theme of my very latest book, which came out a month ago, which is called Birds, Sex and Beauty. And it's about sexual selection, which is the second theory of evolution that Charles Darwin espoused, and which he spent more time trying to persuade people of than natural selection, actually. And this is the idea that mate choice is a very powerful driver of evolution. And the example I use is things like peacock's tails and brightly coloured birds is the result of female preference for males that look like that. They have done the same to males as a cattle breeder does to cattle, as it were. And while it's not conscious in the sense of their planning to do this, it is deliberate in a way.
And is your theory also that some of it is they just like the look of them? They don't think,
the argument has always been, and Darwin lost this argument to Wallace. Wallace said, look, if it is females who are driving coloured plumage, and by the way, I don't think it is, because men choose who they marry, not women. He literally said that. But if it is, then it's really just a form of natural selection, because they're picking the healthiest male, who's most disease resistant or strongest or something like that. Well, if so, why is it so arbitrary? Why are there so many bizarre ways in which birds end up brightly coloured and different things? And a guy called Ronald Fisher, a great statistician in the 1930s, came up with an answer that I think has been now well proven by experiments, which is that what the females are trying to do in these very choosy species, where the females kind of all mate with one male, is not choose the healthiest, they're not after healthy offspring, they're after sexy offspring. They're trying to make sure that their sons get laid, as it were. And once you follow that logic through, then you can see how this form of evolution can produce some really quite spectacular and bizarre results. And I call it the fun version of evolution, because it comes up with bright colours and beautiful songs and all these kind of stuff, which you can't explain by, boring old natural selection, as it were. Sorry, that's a bit of a digression. It gives you...
I think it does explain why people wear brightly coloured waistcoats at Ascot and at weddings.
Well, exactly. Indeed. And the last chapter of this new book has a speculative thing on human beings. I do say, look, birds are more interesting than mammals. I'm not interested in one African ape just because we write about it, but that's us. But I think it is worth considering the possibility that the dramatic and accelerating expansion of the human brain between 2 million and 500,000 years ago, which is quite hard to explain actually, may not be explicable in practical terms, i.e., did we really need that to survive on the savannah? It's a highly expensive organ to have evolved. It caused a lot of death in childbirth along the way and things like that. Lots of other animals managed to make a living on the savannah without developing a big brain. Okay, well, maybe we needed it to survive in large societies and work out who was deceiving who and that kind of thing, perhaps. But just as plausible is this theory called the mating mind, that actually what we use this thing for is to seduce each other. We use it to make music, we use it to make poetry, we use it to make verbal dexterity, we use it to wave our hands in the air, whatever, in such a way as to both sexes, I'm not saying it's one sex or the other, are using big brains to try and impress each other in all sorts of ways. So maybe that's what drove the expansion of the human brain. Now, what we haven't worked out is how to test that theory.
I mean, it does explain a lot about Elon Musk. Okay. And all those children he's meant to have had.
How many is it? About 12 now?
Well, reports vary. It's a bit like
14.
A bit like a former prime minister of ours.
Except that's unknown, isn't it?
So no, certainly. Well, it's known to the courts, I think. But there's another point. Let's get back. So, do you see innovation in all its forms as an unalloyed good for mankind?
No. But I think on the whole you get more good innovation than bad, and the reason for that is because it's easier to sell good innovations. If you make innovations that
of a different kind.
Exactly, there's a smaller market for things that are harmful, and if you think about computer viruses, 25 years ago there were very apocalyptic things going around about how the internet couldn't survive much longer because these viruses were going to ruin it, and people couldn't see the end of it, and this was terrifically worrying, etc. And it kind of didn't happen, did it? I mean, we all have problems occasionally with these things, but it's basically under control. And the reason for that is because if you want to invent a new computer virus, you've got to do it in secret. If you want to invent an antivirus software, you can do it in the open, and you can recruit whoever you want, and you can call on the collective brain of people all over the world. So you can do good innovation in the open, and you have to do bad innovation in secret. I think that's part of the reason. That said, my penultimate book, the book I published in 2021 with Alina Chan, jointly authored, called Viral, is about a very, very harmful piece of innovation indeed, which is the decision to bring viruses from bats in southern China to the middle of a city called Wuhan, do gain-of-function experiments on them, give them the ability to infect humanized mice and train them on those human mice so they get good at infecting human cells. And then do all this, or do a lot of these experiments at biosafety level 2, which is completely inadequate for this work. Whether that led to the pandemic or not, that was crazy stuff to be doing because it had very little upside. The idea was to predict and prevent the next pandemic. Well, that went well, didn't it? We may well have killed north of 20 million people with a piece of bad innovation in the last 5 years. Now, that is unprecedented. Bhopal killed, 25,000 people. I don't think there's another industrial accident bigger than that. So it is an incredibly important issue, this. And what really annoys me, and I've got a piece in the Telegraph saying this tomorrow, is that you can get scientists worked up about the risk of AI or the risk of climate change, but they don't want to talk about this risk, and they don't want to be regulated. They literally say, shouldn't we have more regulation of gain-of-function virology? They say, trust us, we know what we're doing. How dare you regulate us? We know how to do it.
Science the contrary. But let's deal with a few apocalyptics.
Yes.
We had Palmy Olsen here, who wrote her book Supremacy on the AI wars. And let's talk about AI apocalypse, because there's all sorts of theories, and there's and a lot of people, technologists see AI as potentially apocalyptic.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like you agree with them.
Well, I don't, but I don't think anyone knows, including me, how it's going to pan out. I don't have any confidence that I'm right on this. I think it's first of all important to say that many of the bad things that people worry about coming from AI could have come from other forms of automation earlier. Automating agriculture, automating manufacturing. We didn't lose gazillions of jobs. We lost jobs, but we gained jobs in other sectors, and we ended up with just as much employment and actually a lot more leisure and things like that. And we tended to use technologies to assist us rather than to replace us. So, for example, you take sat-nav, it helps us navigate, but it doesn't replace us. And the self-driving car keeps getting a little bit further away. I think, yes, it's there in some settings, but it's not. I don't think that the day when you can actually go to sleep in the back of your Tesla going down the M1 in the middle of November in a snowstorm is on us, frankly.
Without a driver.
But the car that senses when it's got a brake before you do and stays in the lane and things like that, that's all great. So I think augmenting human activity is what AI has been doing and will continue to do. And in that sense, I'm optimistic about it. The big one is, will artificial general intelligence be evil? Will it decide at some point on its own initiative that it's better off just consuming all the resources of the earth and kicking us out the way to do so, like HAL in 2001? Well, the first thing to say is 2001 was, that film was made in 1969, and it was about 2001, and we're 25 years beyond that, and we haven't had that. So that's helpful. But being a biologist, and I had this argument with my wife the other day because she was just back from an AI conference, I said, look, we biologists know that the world is full of viruses and things like that are saying, I really want to capture all the resources in the world and kill everybody. That's kind of what their job description is. And they don't succeed. I mean, Mother Nature is trying to do this on a massive scale every day. So why do we think it's going to be any easier for a silicon-based life form to do this than a carbon-based life form? That's my reassuring argument.
Although we have evolved, it's like smallpox killed off huge populations because they hadn't. We have evolved to defend ourselves against carbon-based threats.
That's
true. We
true.
have not been evolved to protect ourselves against silicon-based ones.
No, and again, I come back to the fact that you might be right, or the gloomsters might be right about this, but given the history of wrong pessimism, I remain sceptical.
Well, and we'll come on to one more sort of piece of optimism, but it does sound like you're not as optimistic as you were, as you said at the outset. What has changed?
You would be hard pressed at a time when the world is borrowing so much money, when China and Russia are returning to autocracy, when wokery and militant Islam are threatening Western civilization. You'd be hard pressed to say everything's going well. Clearly there are some big themes that are going in the wrong direction. And my general view at the moment is that we won't be able to stop innovation improving our lives to some extent. But I think it is going slower than it used to. And if you think about our inability to invent faster aeroplanes or better nuclear power stations, we have hit our head on some ceilings in the last generation, partly through regulation. A lot of that's down to over-regulation, etc. And so the theme of my new book, if I ever get around to writing the damn thing, is that in 2050 or 2070 or something like that, the world will be better off, but not by nearly as much as it could be. Unless we really get better policies. So let me give you, I was telling Roger this, I think, earlier. There's a favourite graph I like, which is the one produced for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change about potential economic scenarios of what happens in the 21st century to see how much emissions each scenario would produce. And there are 5 scenarios that the IPCC uses at the moment. And they vary from one in which GDP per capita doesn't increase very much by 2100 to one where it's 14 times as high globally at the end, which is an amazingly rich world. I mean, ridiculously rich. You know, the average Nigerian would be way richer than the average American is today, right? The description of that world, it's called SSP5, is hilarious, really. It says, because of the use of cheap fossil fuels, the world will have abundant innovation, great social progress, considerable improvements in equality, but terrible emissions. Now, hang on a minute, you know, how much poorer will we be as a result of the effect of those emissions? Instead of 14 times as rich, we'll be 12 times as rich because climate change will have had that effect. Well, you know, why isn't that lesson that you need to free up free enterprise to allow people to innovate, to improve each other's lives? Why is that lesson so widely derided and not accepted? That's my struggle. So I'm incredibly optimistic about what we could achieve, but increasingly pessimistic about my ability and other people's ability to persuade people that that's what we should do. And I'll give you tariffs as the latest example of that. I thought we'd won the argument for free trade 150 years ago with Cobden. Clearly we haven't.
We're sitting here at a point in time, you know, and already those invincible tariffs are being rolled back steadily. And
good.
Not taking that long.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, the bond market is reigning supreme. We have an esteemed and august audience.
We certainly do.
Occupied an awful lot. I've monopolised a lot of your time. Does anyone have any questions? Claire.
I have a question for you about drawing you back to an extraordinary innovation that you put before my eyes in the Red Queen, which was metabolic.
Absolutely. Well, the obesity thing is a very interesting example because, on the one hand, it's a sign of how well we've done. You know, everybody's fat now, not thin. We've got more of a problem with people being too fat than too thin. Well, that's great because we were starving people on a dramatic scale in the 60s. You know, millions of people were starving in famines. And there were predictions it would get much worse in the 70s, instead of which famine has basically gone extinct. It's not quite true, of course, obviously, but it's not far off true. Mass famines just don't happen anymore. There was one in North Korea about 20 years ago. There's a lot of hunger in Sudan and places where there's a war going on, but it's not on the scale we were getting because of absolute lack of food that we were getting in countries like India in the 60s. So it's first worth saying that first. And then saying, like traffic congestion, obesity is a problem of success, as it were. It's a problem of too many calories, not too little. But it's also a problem of the wrong kind of food and that kind of thing. And
it's a problem of poverty.
Exactly. I mean, it's correlated with poverty, certainly.
A problem of ignorance.
But we also made a huge mistake in saying it's all about eating fat. and it's not. It's all about eating carbs. It's not. Again, that's an oversimplification, but it's basically not untrue that we now recognise that a carb-rich diet is much more likely to make you fat than a fat-rich.
I want to quickly turn, because on the subject of AI, and Richard, I will come back to you in a moment. We have somebody else here tonight who's written a book on AI. Roger, you've written on AI, as I say, which I admired. Do your views chime with?
They do, largely. What plays a very important part here, because in all parties across the commons, remarkable figures you had in the 30 or 40 years after the...
I think we've got to be careful not to be too nostalgic about politicians in the past as well as today. When I read history, I'm always gobsmacked by the triviality of the things that some of these people did and thought. I read Chip Channon's diaries recently, and that doesn't give you a warm glow about 1930s politicians, for example, or 1950s ones.
Asquith's,
Exactly. Yes, that was an amazing book. Yeah. But also the one thing that has changed dramatically, particularly in the last 25 years, is the degree of outsourcing of political decisions to experts. Through the quangocracy in particular, the Supreme Court, the OBR, all these different organisations that are just that one step removed from democratic accountability, which is thought to be a good thing. That's why it's done, so they're not constantly looking over their shoulder at the next election. But I don't think it's been a great success myself. I agree with Trump and Truss, if you like, to some extent on this, that they are effectively ending up being bodies that, the way I put it, is the National Paperclip Authority. You may think its job is to improve the supply of paperclips to every high street in the country. It isn't. Its job is to maximise the budget of the National Paperclips Authority. That's the way it behaves, and that's true of every quango. And so I think it's a bit of a mistake to blame the elected politicians for things being so poor in the last 20 or 30 years. I think we need to include the bureaucratic class in that too.
Other than the politicians allowed themselves to be sort of derogated.
Absolutely, yeah, well that's true, of course,
but
yes.
Has their decline in productivity since 2000 exceeded the decline in productivity of any other civil service and NHS anywhere in the Western world?
Well, I mean, I'm not picking on Britain here. I mean, I think
I'm not picking on Britain. I love Britain.
Yeah, well, but I don't think our bureaucracy is necessarily worse than everyone else. But I think that has been a trend throughout the world, and the absolutely mystifying, shocking statistic is that there has been no improvement in productivity in about 25 years in the public sector. Let me finish the sentence, because that's very important. Of course, there's been a dramatic improvement in the private sector, and so how can how can that be in an era of the iPhone, the internet, one-click ordering, etc.? It's how can you possibly achieve zero productivity?
As the of the NHS has stepped down, how much of our standard of living today across the world is driven actually by a fuel which we probably spent all on, and it sits there probably quite radioactively. So
I think it's a serious problem in particularly America because of the dollar being reserve currency, but also here that we are effectively borrowing our grandchildren's inheritance in order to reward ourselves with often current spending. We call it welfare, and it's right, it is, but it's not investment. It's spending. That's a huge problem, but it's a problem of the Western world. And when you think about it, the world is not in debt. I'm looking at Roger to confirm this, because who do we owe money to? Mars? There is for every debt there is a credit somewhere.
but we don't. Sorry, that's not
Now,
right.
all true, but what supports the US bond market, Chinese people buying dollars.
Confidence.
No, but that's part of it too. But the point is that the point I'm trying to make is that over borrowing is a problem of the Western world, not the rest of the world.
It's a problem with China and Japan.
There's another problem.
Well, yeah, but that, you're talking about the governments there, but the population are not. Most of them are saving.
No, but nor is the British
Household debt.
British population has a positive net asset base.
Exactly.
Or 11
So
trillion.
you have to look at where there's saving and where there's borrowing, and globally they match.
2% comes from big corporates. We're in a gutted landing position for any company that wants to avoid tax.
But the UK stepped up the percentage of income it took in tax in the First World War, in the Second World War, in the pandemic. And in each case, it hasn't gone back down. And I can't. Do you use 45% or 35% these days? Because I can never remember.
60% in Scotland.
Well, no, I'm not talking about tax rates. I'm talking about the percentage of
38%
GDP. 38% of GDP. But there's another figure which is 45%. I can't remember what it is. But anyway, the point is that's pretty close to the amount, the highest you can get out of an economy. You can't increase taxes much more than that without completely destroying enterprise, as I'm afraid Rachel Reeves is likely to show us over the next few years. And where the correlation between high taxes and slow growth is a very good one in the world. So we ought to take notice of that, oughtn't we?
I did promise that this would come to a close, the formal proceedings at 7, because one or two people have suppers to go to. I have several things to say. First of all, I'll come to you last because I want the biggest hand for you, Matt. First of all, please do go on your social media and please do let people know about this evening and about the book club. I would be really grateful if you do. We have some great events coming up and you'll be invited to all of them. And we are sponsoring the Chalk History Festival in the summer, largely so I can go and stalk a number of historians to come and talk in the autumn.
It's a great festival, that. Yeah.
It's tremendous. And please, if you're interested in coming to Chalk, let me know because it is, I think the greatest of all the book festivals. I think a columnist called it Glastonbury for the mind. That might have been me, but anyway. Second, there are a selection of Matt's books at the back of the room. Please choose one. Matt, if you would do the honours, there is a special H Advisors Sharpie here, ready for you to sign them. There is a full selection both from his latest and, of course, The Rational Optimist. I have a great thank you. This was given to me as a present, this very copy, actually, by Luke Johnson 15 years ago when I was... Actually, I was very ill. I'd had kidney failure and I didn't know what the future held at all. And I got all sorts of baskets of fruit and the odd bunch of flowers and they were all very nice. But Luke was the friend of mine who put the most thought into it and gave me a book that did really put me on the road to recovery. So I have a huge debt of thanks to Luke and to you for writing it, not least. And I think actually from our conversations the last few weeks, it has still left me more optimistic than you are. And so please look out for further invitations. We'll have a series. And what else do I have to mention? Nothing else other than to give you a huge thank you for coming and showing us the polymath, the Renaissance man that you are.
I don't know. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks very much.